Welcome to our deep dive into real toughness. We've got excerpts from Steve Magness's book, Do Hard Things, ready to be dissected. It challenges so much of what we think we know about grit and resilience. And pushing through discomfort,
Mm.
we're going to uncover how to train your mind for challenges instead of just trying to endure them.
Yeah, what's fascinating about Magnus's approach is that he doesn't shy away from real-world examples, even tragic ones. Like he starts with the story of Jordan McNair, the University of Maryland football player, who tragically died from heat stroke.
Yeah, that story always gets to me. It's easy to think, well, that's elite college athletics. It's a different world.
Hmm.
But it's a stark reminder of what can happen when we prioritize a push through at all costs mentality.
Hmm.
What I find particularly interesting, though, is how Magnus connects this to a larger trend.
Exactly. He points to a concerning pattern of injuries and deaths, particularly cases of rhabdomyolysis, linked to these extreme workouts. It's like that old-school toughness training is creating fragility, not resilience.
He even compares it to teaching someone to swim by chucking them in the deep end. Some might make it, but a lot of folks would sink. And that really resonated with me. I mean, I've definitely had moments where I thought I was being tough, but was actually just ignoring my body's signals. Remember that time I completely lost my voice during that big race?
Yes. You're experiencing vocal cord dysfunction, a medical condition, not a lack of toughness. That's a perfect example of how sometimes pushing through is the opposite of what we need to do.
For sure. And that actually leads perfectly into Magnus's analysis of Coach Bear Bryant's legendary Junction Boys training camp. This was supposed to be the ultimate example of forging toughness in a football team. But Magnus reveals a surprising truth. Many of the key players on Bryant's later championship teams didn't endure that brutal camp. So what does that tell us about the necessity of suffering for success?
Right. It makes you question the whole premise. And what's even more interesting is how this rethinking of toughness isn't limited to sports. Even the military, often seen as the epitome of grit and resilience, has shifted its approach.
Instead of just weeding out the weak from the strong,
Yeah.
the focus has moved toward equipping individuals with the skills to handle high-stress situations.
Exactly. The SERI program, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, is a great example. They extensively train soldiers in survival skills and psychological resilience before putting them through intense simulations.
So they're not just throwing them to the wolves and seeing who survives. They're equipping them with the tools to navigate those challenges. This whole idea of toughness as teaching is so powerful. But what does it actually look like in practice? What's Magnus's take on the psychology of toughness?
Well, Magnus argues that real toughness is about having the capacity to face discomfort, to lean in, pay attention to what's happening, and create the space to make thoughtful decisions. And he offers a really practical tool for doing this, the blank wall exercise.
Okay, so how does staring at a blank wall make you tougher? That sounds more like something a monk would do.
It might sound counterintuitive, but it's about building comfort with discomfort. Magnus says that we're so used to constant stimulation that we've lost the ability to just be with ourselves. The blank wall exercise helps you train your mind to tolerate boredom and resist those urges to constantly check your phone or distract yourself.
So it's like building mental endurance.
Exactly. And that mental endurance is crucial when you're facing a challenging situation. You're less likely to get swept away by your emotions or make impulsive decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does this all tie into that anxiety we all feel when, say, we're waiting for a text back from someone we like?
Oh, that's a good one. Magnus uses that example to illustrate how our brains are constantly appraising situations, assessing whether something is a threat or a challenge.
And that appraisal triggers a cascade of physiological responses.
Right. So if our brain perceives a threat, we go into fight or flight mode, our heart rate goes up, we start sweating, we might feel anxious or scared. But if we perceive a challenge, our body prepares us to rise to the occasion. We feel a surge of energy, our focus sharpens, and we're more likely to think clearly and creatively.
So two completely different reactions based on how we perceive the situation.
Exactly. And this is where the role of the amygdala comes in. It's like our brain's threat detection system. When it senses danger, it sends out an alarm, triggering that stress response.
So someone who's constantly stressed out might have an overactive amygdala.
That's a possibility. But what's interesting is that we can actually train our amygdala to be less reactive. Magnus highlights the example of Alex Honnold, the guy who free solo climbed El Capitan. Honnold's amygdala barely even registered a blip when shown disturbing images. He'd essentially trained his brain to see challenges differently, almost as a non-issue.
That's incredible. So Honnold was able to rewire his brain's threat response system through deliberate practice. I'm curious about how that relates to the average person who isn't scaling massive rock faces.
Magnus argues that we can all learn to reframe our perception of challenging situations. He even provides 5 specific tools to help us develop a more accurate appraisal. One of those tools is focusing on what you can control.
That makes sense. When you feel overwhelmed, it's easy to get stuck in that fight or flight mode and lose sight of what you can actually do.
Right. And another tool is understanding your typical response to stress. Do you tend to shut down, lash out, or become hyper-focused on the negative?
This reminds me of that study about firefighters under stress. Even when they were presented with negative news unrelated to their job, their minds fixated on the bad stuff. It shows how stress can really warp our perception.
It's a powerful example of how our thoughts and emotions can influence our interpretation of events, and it highlights the importance of developing self-awareness and consciously choosing how we want to respond to stress. Magnus also talks about the importance of understanding our tendencies
Right.
to overestimate or underestimate our abilities.
This is where confidence comes into play, right?
Yeah,
Knowing what you're truly capable of.
exactly. And Magnus differentiates between 2 types of confidence: the genuine kind, based on experience and competence, and the fake kind, driven by insecurity and bravado. He shares a hilarious anecdote about Daryl, a college student who was convinced he could run a 4.4 40-yard dash.
Spoiler alert,
Yep.
he couldn't.
Yeah?
It seems like a lot of us fall into that trap of overestimating our abilities,
Hmm.
especially when we're trying to project an image of confidence.
It's like that compliment paper exercise you mentioned earlier. Some of those compliments felt genuine and meaningful, while others were just empty platitudes, right?
Yes. It was eye-opening to see the difference between praise that actually boosts your confidence and praise that just feels good in the moment but doesn't have any substance. Do you think the self-esteem movement contributed to this problem of conflating real confidence with superficial praise?
Magnus argues that the well-intentioned focus on praising everyone regardless of achievement may have inadvertently fueled this trend.
So how do we break free from the cycle of fake confidence?
Magnus outlines 4 key strategies for cultivating genuine confidence: lowering the bar while raising the floor, embracing imperfection, trusting your training, and developing a quiet ego.
That lowering the bar while raising the floor concept intrigues me. What exactly does he mean by that?
It's about shifting your focus from constantly achieving your absolute best to establishing a consistent baseline of performance. Think of it like building a solid foundation before adding the fancy roof. You're aiming for reliable competence, which then allows you to take calculated risks and push beyond your comfort zone when the opportunity arises.
So it's about being consistently good rather than sporadically great.
Exactly. It's about building that solid foundation of confidence based on real skills and experience, not just hype and bravado. And that foundation is crucial when you're facing tough challenges and need to make those high-stakes decisions.
This is all reminding me of that research on learned helplessness. It's a bit unsettling, but I think it highlights just how important a sense of control is for our well-being.
Absolutely. Magnus dives into those classic experiments with dogs who were subjected to electric shocks. The dogs who couldn't escape the shocks initially later gave up, even when escape was possible.
It's heartbreaking, but it reveals a powerful truth about the human psyche. When we feel like we have no control over our circumstances, we can become passive and resigned, even when opportunities for change arise.
Magnus even connects this to the historical example of the early Jamestown settlers.
Wasn't there a theory that the high death rates in Jamestown weren't solely due to starvation and disease, but also a pervasive sense of helplessness?
Yes, that's one of the prevailing theories. The settlers faced so much adversity that they essentially lost the will to fight for survival.
It's amazing how a lack of control can impact not just our mental state, but our physical health as well. And this is where Peter Bourne's research on soldiers during the Vietnam War comes in.
Those studies measured cortisol levels in soldiers. And the ones who had a greater sense of control over their situations actually coped better with the stress of combat. Their cortisol levels were lower, and they showed more resilience overall.
So a sense of agency can literally buffer us against stress.
It seems that way. And Magnus argues that this understanding of control is crucial for building real toughness. He uses the example of VO2 max treadmill tests, where the runner has no control over the speed or incline.
That's a great analogy because you're basically stuck until you hit your limit, which can feel pretty demoralizing.
Right. It's the opposite of having a sense of agency. Magnus proposes that to cultivate toughness, we need to create opportunities for choice and autonomy in our training and our lives.
He even provides concrete strategies for how individuals can cultivate more control. and how leaders can give control back to their teams.
Yes. For individuals, it's about focusing on what you can control, setting realistic goals, creating action plans, and engaging in self-reflection.
And for leaders,
Mhm.
it's about fostering a supportive environment, delegating responsibility, providing constructive feedback, and allowing for mistakes.
It's about empowering people, not controlling them.
This all makes so much sense.
Mhm.
But how does it connect to the idea of listening to our bodies? It seems like we're talking about two very different things.
That's a great question, and it leads us perfectly into the next chapter of Magnus's book. He starts by describing a fascinating experiment conducted on the Capilano suspension bridge. This experiment is a classic. Researchers found that men walking across that swaying high-altitude bridge were more likely to find the female researcher at the other end attractive.
Okay, I remember reading about this study. It all comes down to misattribution of arousal, right? The men were experiencing physiological arousal due to fear, but their brains misinterpreted it as attraction,
Exactly. It's a fantastic illustration of how our brains aren't always accurate in interpreting our internal signals, especially in heightened emotional states.
which can lead to some pretty interesting and potentially disastrous decisions.
Absolutely. And that's why Magnus emphasizes the importance of understanding what he calls interoceptive signals. Those messages our bodies are sending us about how we're feeling. It's about being able to discern between, say, the jitters of excitement and the heart-pounding fear of a genuine threat.
So we need to be more mindful of those subtle physical sensations and what they're telling us. It's not always as straightforward as it seems.
Right. And Magnus uses a really clever pop culture reference to drive this point home. The Jack and Rose scene from Titanic.
You mean the part where they're both clinging to that piece of floating debris after the ship sinks?
Exactly. Magnus poses a thought-provoking question. How would we perceive that situation differently if Jack hadn't sacrificed himself? If Rose had demanded that he get off the makeshift raft?
That's a really interesting question. It makes you think about how our judgments about a situation can change based on choice and agency.
Right. It's not just about the physical circumstances. It's about how we interpret those circumstances and the role we play in them.
It's like our emotional response and our moral judgment are intertwined in a way that we don't always consciously recognize.
And Magnus even connects this to the classic trolley problem, where you have to decide whether to sacrifice one person to save five. The research shows that our brains react differently to personal harm versus impersonal harm, adding another layer of complexity to our decision-making processes.
It's amazing how much nuance there is to our emotional processing and how it impacts the choices we make.
It is, and Magnus's point is that developing a deeper understanding of these interoceptive signals is essential for building real toughness. It's not just about powering through, it's about developing the ability to read and reframe those internal signals so we can make more skillful choices under pressure.
So he's not saying we should ignore our feelings. It's more about becoming aware of them and using them as valuable sources of information.
Precisely. He even provides a 5-step process for doing just that. It starts with simply noticing those physical sensations, then labeling your emotions, identifying your typical reaction patterns, and finally, finding ways to reappraise those signals based on a more objective assessment of the situation.
It's like we're learning to become more fluent in the language of our bodies.
Exactly. And that fluency allows us to have a more productive conversation with ourselves, which is what Magnus calls the calm conversation.
This is where he tells that gripping story about Stephen Callahan, yes, who survived 76 days adrift at sea.
Right.
Yes.
Callahan endured incredible hardship, but he managed to stay mentally resilient by dividing his mind into two characters, a captain and a crewman.
It's fascinating how he personified those different parts of himself. It's almost like those dueling voices we all experience in our heads. But he gave them distinct roles and responsibilities.
Right. His crewman acknowledged the fear, pain, and despair, while his captain remained calm and focused, making the rational decisions necessary for survival.
It's such a powerful illustration of how we can manage those internal conflicts, those angels and devils on our shoulders, to navigate challenging situations.
Magnus connects this to the idea of multiple selves, even drawing a parallel to the Pixar movie Inside Out, where those adorable characters represent different emotions vying for control.
I love that analogy. It makes this complex psychological concept so much more relatable.
It does, and he then differentiates between two types of inner dialogue, integrated and confrontational.
So with integrated dialogue, it's more like a calm, collaborative conversation between those different parts of ourselves, working together to find a solution.
Right, it's about finding that common ground. But with confrontational dialogue, It's an all-out battle between those inner voices, which can lead to more emotional distress and less effective decision-making.
This reminds me of when you were talking about overt self-talk
Mm-hmm.
and how it can be more effective than just having those conversations in your head. I remember reading about a study with 6-year-old children.
Yes. The study found that the children who used third-person self-talk, like, he can do it, were better able to stay focused and persevere on a boring task compared to those who used first-person self-talk, like, I can do it.
It's amazing how that subtle shift in language can impact our behavior. I even remember you sharing a personal anecdote about using overt self-talk during a tough race.
You were struggling and you started talking to yourself out loud, like you were coaching yourself through it.
I did, and it actually helped. It was like shifting from that internal battle to a more objective, almost coach-like perspective. Do you think it has something to do with that idea of psychological distance?
Magnus believes so. He argues that by putting some space between ourselves and our immediate emotions, we can see situations more clearly and make more rational choices.
So it's like we're creating that mental breathing room to respond skillfully rather than just react impulsively.
Exactly. And he outlines a two-step process for developing that calm conversation, creating space and keeping your mind steady. The blank wall exercise we talked about earlier is a great way to start creating that space.
And what about keeping your mind steady? That sounds like a pretty tall order,
Hmm.
especially in the midst of chaos.
It is. But Magnus offers some practical advice. He talks about the importance of equanimity.
So when we talk about equanimity,
Mm-hmm.
are we talking about just suppressing your emotions? Because that doesn't sound very healthy or sustainable.
It's not about denying your emotions. Equanimity is more about cultivating a sense of inner peace and stability, even when things are tough. Magnus shares Scott Barry Kaufman's definition, which emphasizes being mindful, open to new information, and accepting of reality.
That sounds a lot more balanced than just pretending everything's fine when it's not. But how do we actually cultivate that kind of equanimity? It seems like a pretty advanced mental state.
Magnus argues that it starts with acceptance. When we resist uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, we actually give them more power. Acceptance, on the other hand, creates space for a more skillful response.
It's like that old saying, what you resist persists. The more you try to push something away,
Hmm.
the more it seems to stick around. It reminds me of my own relationship with fatigue and pain when I'm running.
You used to really struggle with it, right?
Oh, yeah. In the beginning, I would tense up,
Mm-hmm.
get frustrated,
Hmm.
and try to push through the discomfort. But it just made things worse. Over time, I've learned to accept those sensations as feedback from my body and adjust my pace or effort accordingly. It's still uncomfortable,
Yeah.
but it's not this huge mental battle anymore.
That's a great example of how a shift in our inner dialogue can make a world of difference. And it's a key part of having that calm conversation Magnus talks about. It's about slowing down that cascade of thoughts and emotions, creating a pause where you can choose how to respond.
So it's not about eliminating negative thoughts and feelings altogether. It's about changing our relationship with them.
Exactly. And that leads us to another crucial element of real toughness: motivation. Magnus starts this section with a pretty intense story about Julie, a college athlete whose coach used incredibly controlling, almost cult-like tactics to motivate the team.
It sounds like those fear-based methods that a lot of coaches still use,
Yeah.
thinking it's the only way to push athletes to their limits.
It's a pervasive belief that external pressure is necessary for motivation. But as Magnus points out, that approach often backfires. It might work in the short term, but it doesn't lead to sustainable success or well-being.
So what's the alternative? If we're not supposed to rely on fear and intimidation, how do we cultivate the kind of motivation that fuels real toughness?
Magnus argues that the most powerful and sustainable motivation comes from within. He calls it intrinsic motivation, and research shows that it's linked to greater persistence, re-engagement, and overall well-being.
It makes sense. When you're genuinely passionate about
Mhm.
something, you don't need someone yelling at you to put in the effort.
Exactly. And Magnus uses a really powerful example to illustrate the importance of intrinsic motivation: mountain climbers on Everest.
I've heard stories about how some climbers become so fixated on reaching the summit that they make reckless decisions, even when it's clear they should turn back.
It's a classic example of how the pursuit of a goal can become so all-consuming that it overrides common sense and even self-preservation.
So how does this tie into intrinsic motivation?
Magnus emphasizes the importance of re-engaging with your why when a goal becomes unattainable. For those climbers on Everest, the initial goal of reaching the summit might need to shift to the more fundamental goal of survival.
So it's about adapting your goals and motivations to the reality of the situation, not blindly pushing forward no matter what.
Right. And that adaptability is a key hallmark of real toughness. Magnus also talks about autonomous motivation, which has three core components: autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Those sound familiar. Didn't we touch on those earlier when we were talking about control and confidence?
We did. And they're all interconnected. Autonomy is about having a sense of control over your actions. Competence is about feeling capable and effective. And relatedness is about feeling connected to others.
So it's not just about being a lone wolf, toughing it out on your own. It's about having a supportive community and feeling like you belong.
Exactly. And Magnus argues that satisfying these basic psychological needs is fundamental to building real toughness. He even cites research showing that when these needs are met, people perform better, experience greater well-being, and are more resilient in the face of challenges.
That makes me think of Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors. He's known for giving his players a lot of autonomy and ownership over the game.
He's even turned over coaching duties to his players during games.
It's amazing that a coach at that level is willing to relinquish control in that way. It goes against everything we think we know about leadership in professional sports.
But it's clearly working for him. And it speaks to the power of creating an environment where people feel trusted, respected, and empowered.
Which brings us back to that idea of belonging and connection. Earlier, you mentioned some research on NBA players, where displays of trust and cooperation were actually correlated with better team performance.
Yes, it wasn't just about the fist bumps and high fives themselves. It was about what those actions represented, a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose.
It's like those little gestures reinforce the feeling that they were all in it together.
Exactly. And Magnus highlights the example of Greg Popovich, the legendary coach of the San Antonio Spurs. He's famous for his elaborate team dinners, which are more than just meals. They're opportunities for players and coaches to connect on a personal level, to build those bonds of trust and friendship that translate to better teamwork on the court.
It's a great reminder that fostering a sense of belonging is not just some touchy-feely HR initiative.
Yeah.
It's a crucial ingredient for building a high-performing team, whether it's in sports, business, or any other field.
And it brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, meaning as the ultimate motivator. Magnus circles back to Viktor Frankl, the Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust.
Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is such a powerful testament to the human capacity for resilience, even in the face of unimaginable suffering.
And he argued that even in the darkest of times, we have the power to choose our attitude and find meaning in our experiences.
Magnus shares research on Holocaust survivors, which found that those who were able to make meaning of their experiences, to find a purpose in their suffering, were more likely to thrive in the aftermath.
It's a profound reminder that our capacity for resilience is deeply tied to our ability to find meaning and purpose, even in the most challenging circumstances.
You know, it's interesting. When I was going through my own struggles with OCD, it was so easy to get lost in the anxiety and fear. But what ultimately helped me was finding a way to integrate those experiences into my story, to see them as part of a larger journey of growth and resilience.
That's such a powerful insight. It's not about pretending those difficult experiences didn't happen. It's about finding a way to make sense of them, to learn from them, and to use them to fuel our own resilience.
And that seems like a fitting conclusion to our deep dive into real toughness. It's not just about physical strength or mental grit. It's about cultivating self-awareness, mastering our inner dialogue, finding meaning in our struggles, and connecting with others in meaningful ways.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring all the different facets of real toughness, and I think the key takeaway is that it's a process, not a destination. It's something we cultivate over time through practice, self-reflection, and a willingness to embrace discomfort as a catalyst for growth. What stood out to you most from this deep dive? What are you going to explore further? Remember, real toughness is a journey, not a destination. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep choosing the difficult path that